My name is Miguel Hernandez. I am 43 years old, and tonight I cannot sleep. I am sitting on the edge of this rickety bed, in this room that smells of damp and the beans my Salvadoran neighbor cooked 3 hours ago. The light from the bare bulb hanging from the ceiling casts strange shadows on the peeling walls. And outside, you can hear the constant roar of cars on the freeway, that sound that has become the background music of my life in Los Angeles. My hands are rough and resting on my knees, these hands that permanently smell of bleach and sweat, marked by 15 years of cleaning offices, carrying boxes, doing jobs that gringos don't want to do. My phone is on the dresser, silent for 2 days now. They don't call me from Mexico anymore like they used to. They don't need me like they used to. The air is heavy, laden with the heat trapped between these cheap apartment buildings. I can hear through the thin walls. Doña Carmen's television blaring soap operas, a baby crying upstairs, and the English-speaking screams of a couple who always fight on Sunday nights. I run my hand over my face, feeling the 3-day beard that I no longer bother to shave like I used to. My eyes are swollen, not from exhaustion, but from something that has been building up in my chest for months, maybe years. It's a pressure that squeezes my ribs, making it hard to breathe deeply. Do you know what it feels like to be a ghost in your own family? Do you know what it feels like to work like a mule for 15 years to bring your loved ones to this country, only to discover that they adapted so quickly that they no longer recognize you? That to them, you are no longer Miguel, the father, the husband, the man who sacrificed everything. Now I'm just the illegal who works 2 shifts to pay the bills, the one who speaks broken English, the one who smells like cleaning products and embarrasses them in front of their American friends. I touch the crumpled photo I have in my wallet, the only one I brought from Mexico 15 years ago. We are all together in the yard of our little house in Michoacan. My wife Rosa in her flowery dress, my young children smiling toothlessly, and me, younger, with eyes full of hope and plans. We were poor, but we were a family. Now we are middle class in America, but we are strangers living under the same roof. The smell of tortillas coming from the building's kitchen transports me for a second to our house in Uruapan, where Rosa made tortillas by hand every morning, and the smoke from the comal mixed with the crowing of the neighbors' roosters. But here there are no roosters, only ambulance sirens and the constant hum of the air conditioner that never works properly. I close my eyes and allow myself to remember. Because tonight, in this loneliness that envelops me like a heavy sirop, I need to understand how I got here. I need to tell my story, even if it's only to the walls of this room that knows all my secrets, all my tears as a man who isn't supposed to cry. It all started 15 years ago, when I thought that crossing the border was just a matter of walking toward a better future. I was born in a small town near Uruapan, Michoacan, where the streets are made of dirt and stone, and when it rains, they turn into brown rivers that sweep away everything in their path. Our house was made of adobe with a tin roof, and when it rained, it sounded like giant drums that kept us awake. But I liked that sound because it meant that the cornfields would grow green and tall. My dad, Jesus Hernandez, was a short, stocky man, like an avocado tree trunk, with the biggest hands I've ever seen. Hands that could pull up a whole corn plant in one tug. He always smelled of damp earth and cheap tobacco, and he had a scar on his forehead from when he fell off a horse as a child. When he came home from the fields at dusk, his footsteps crunched the dry leaves that had accumulated in the yard, and we ran to hug his legs even though he was all dirty. "Son," he always said to me, Work won't kill you, but laziness will. It was his favorite saying, and he repeated it while washing his hands in the cement sink he had built himself behind the house. The water was always ice cold, even on the hottest days, because it came directly from the mountain spring. My mother, Esperanza, was the complete opposite. Thin as a willow branch, but with a strength you couldn't see. Her black hair was always tied back in a braid that reached her waist, and when she let it down at night to brush it, the whole house was filled with the smell of chamomile from her homemade shampoo. Her hands were always busy, making tortillas, mending clothes, healing scrapes with herbs she grew in rusty cans. I remember waking up every morning to the sound of the metate, that constant rhythm of stone against stone as she ground chili peppers for salsa. Rap, rap, rap. And then the hiss of the pressure cooker with the beans, and then her voice singing softly songs by José Alfredo Jiménez as she lit the comal. Sundays were different. I would wake up to the smell of hot chocolate and sweet bread that my dad bought in town, and the sound of church bells ringing so loud that it seemed like they were going to break the windows. We would get dressed in the clean clothes that my mom had washed on Saturday in the river, and we would all walk together down the dusty path to the center. During the week, when there was no school, I helped my dad in the cornfield. I learned to tell when the corn was ready by the sound the leaves made when they moved in the wind, a dry whisper that was different from the damp sound of young plants. I learned to feel the rain hours before it came, by the way the air smelled and the way the animals behaved. I spent my afternoons playing marbles with my cousins in the dirt yard, marking circles with a stick and competing to see who had the best aim. The sound of the marbles colliding was our soundtrack, along with the barking of the neighborhood dogs and the cries of the vendors passing by with their baskets. Oaxaca and tamales, corn and esquites. When I got sick with measles at age 7, my mom took care of me day and night with herbal teas that tasted bitter but relieved my fever. I remember lying on my mat, burning with fever, and feeling her cool hands on my forehead as she sang La Llorona in a soft voice. The room smelled of eucalyptus and wax candles she had lit for the Virgin of Guadalupe. "My boy is going to get better," she would whisper as she gave me hibiscus tea with a pewter spoon. And I believed her, because my mother's hands were magical. They could cure anything just by touching it. The school was 2 kilometers from the village, a gray concrete building with classrooms that filled with dust during the dry season and mud when it rained. We walked along a path that crossed 2 streams, and in the rainy season we had to take off our shoes to wade through them. The icy water numbed our feet, but we ran to school to warm up. My teacher, Miss Remedios, was an older woman who always wore long skirts and blouses buttoned up to her neck. She had a hoarse voice from shouting in the classroom, and her black shoes echoed on the cement floor as she walked between the desks checking our homework. She smelled like talcum powder and coffee, and when she got mad at us, her ears turned red. "Miguel Hernandez," she would say to me, "you have a good head for numbers, but you're too distracted for letters." And she was right. While she explained grammar, I would stare out the window at the mountains, imagining what might be on the other side, what adventures awaited me when I grew up. When I was 14, I started working on weekends at the mechanic's shop owned by Don Aurelio, a fat man who always had his hands black with grease and chewed gum by the pound while he fixed cars. The shop smelled of burnt oil and gasoline, a strong smell that clung to my clothes and that my mother hated. "Boy," Don Aurelio would shout over the noise of the tools, "pass me that cross wrench." And I would run to find it among the rusty toolboxes, happy to feel useful to earn my first few pesos. The sound of compressed air and constant hammering became the music of my Saturdays. It was in the workshop that I met Rosa. She came in one day with her dad to fix a flat tire on her bike, and I stood there like a fool watching her from behind a car. She was 15, with brown hair tied back in a ponytail that shone in the sun, and she was wearing a light blue dress that fit her perfectly. When she laughed at something her dad said, her laughter sounded like little bells. "What are you looking at, boy?" Don Aurelio shouted at me, and I turned red as a tomato, but I couldn't stop looking at her. She had the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen, brown like the earth after rain. And when she turned to look at me for a second, I felt my stomach churn with nervousness. I started making up excuses to pass by Rosa's house, which was on the other side of town. I said I was going to buy cigarettes for my dad, or that I had to deliver a message. But really, I just wanted to see her sweeping the yard or hanging clothes on the clothesline. The house always smelled of bougainvillea flowers and chicken stew, and ranchera music could be heard coming from the radio in the kitchen. It took me 3 months to work up the courage to talk to her. It was a Sunday after Mass, when she was chatting with her friends in the church courtyard. I approached her, trembling like a leaf, my hands sweaty and my mouth dry. "Rosa," I said, and my voice came out like a squeak. Would you like to walk with me to the river?" She looked at me with those eyes that melted me, smiled a little, and said, "Okay, but only as far as the willow trees." We walked in silence along the path that led to the river, listening to the song of the mockingbirds and the murmur of the water running between the stones. I didn't know what to say, but being with her felt like being at Mass, like something sacred that I didn't want to ruin with silly words. "My dad says you're a hard worker," she said suddenly, her voice sounding like music. "He says Don Aurelio speaks highly of you." "I just do what he asks me to do," I replied, and immediately regretted sounding so dull. But Rosa laughed, that bell-like laugh, and took my hand. Her hand was soft and warm, and when I felt it in mine, I knew I was going to marry that woman, even if I had to work my whole life to deserve her. I married Rosa when I turned 20 in a small ceremony in the village church, with a dress that my mother-in-law and my aunts had sewn, and a borrowed suit that was a little too big for me but made me feel like a prince. The church smelled of incense and marigolds, and when Rosa appeared at the door on her father's arm, I forgot to breathe. Her hair was adorned with fresh flowers, and her white dress fit her as if it had been made by angels. As she walked toward the altar, her footsteps on the stone floor sounded like music, and the entire church was filled with murmurs of admiration. "The bride is so beautiful," I heard my Aunt Esperanza whisper. Father Marcelo, an old man who had known our family since before we were born, married us with a smile that wrinkled his whole face. "Miguel," he said after the readings, "do you take Rosa as your wife, to love and respect her in good times and bad?" "Yes, I do," I said, and my voice sounded louder than I expected, filling the entire church. When we kissed at the end of the ceremony, Rosa tasted like milk caramel and nerves, and I felt my whole body fill with electricity. Fireworks exploded outside the church, and the mariachi band we had hired began to play Las Mañanitas, while people threw rice and confetti at us. The party was in my parents' backyard, with long tables made of planks and trestles, covered with white tablecloths that my mom had ironed until they were perfect. We slaughtered 2 pigs and a calf, and the women of the village arrived early to make mole, tamales, and pozole that smelled heavenly. We danced until sunrise to the rhythm of La Negra, and El Jarabe Tapatio. And when Rosa took off her shoes because her feet hurt, she continued dancing barefoot on the dirt of the patio, laughing like a little girl. I couldn't believe that this woman was my wife, that she was going to sleep next to me every night for the rest of my life. Our first home was a small room we rented behind Doña Carmen's house, with an iron bed that creaked every time we moved, a wood-burning stove, and a small table my dad had made for me as a wedding gift. The walls were unpainted adobe, and at night the cold seeped in, making us hug each other tighter under the wool blanket my mother-in-law had knitted for us. Every morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and freshly made tortillas. Rosa got up before me to prepare my lunch and iron my work clothes. I watched her move around the small kitchen as if she were dancing, her hair falling over her shoulders, singing softly as she stirred the beans. "Good morning, my love," she would say when she saw me wake up, and she would give me a kiss that tasted of coffee and hope. I worked in construction with a crew of bricklayers, carrying bags of cement and mixing mortar under the sun that baked our backs. I didn't earn much, but it was enough to cover basic expenses and give Rosa a peso now and then for her cravings. On Saturdays, we would go to the town market, walking among the stalls selling fruit, vegetables, and used clothes, planning how to furnish our little house. When Rosa got pregnant for the first time, I was 23, and she was 22. She realized it because she craved green mangoes with chili all the time, and because she threw up every morning for 2 months. The day she told me, we were sitting on the bed after dinner, and she took my hands with that smile that made me fall in love with her every day. "Miguel," she said, her voice trembling a little, "we're going to have a baby." I felt as if I had been struck by lightning. I was silent for a long time, feeling Rosa's hands in mine, listening to the crickets singing outside the window. Then I hugged her so tightly that I was afraid of hurting her, and I cried like I hadn't cried since I was a child. "We're going to have a child," I repeated, as if I needed to say it to believe it. The pregnancy was difficult. Rosa swelled up like a balloon, and her back hurt all the time. I worked double shifts to pay the town doctor, and I came home exhausted but happy to rub her swollen feet and feel the baby move in her belly. Miguel Jr. was born in the early hours of March, after 20 hours of labor that nearly killed me from nerves. I held him in my arms for the first time when he was 5 minutes old, all wrinkled and red, crying with a voice that didn't seem of this world. He weighed about 3 pounds, but when he closed his little hand around my finger, I felt that my whole life had meaning. 2 years later, Esperanza, my beautiful girl, arrived. She was born with my grandmother's blue eyes and her mother's strong character. She was a cranky and capricious baby, but when she laughed, dimples appeared on her cheeks that melted my heart. By the time I was 28, there were 5 of us: Miguel Jr., Esperanza, little Carlos, who arrived as a surprise, Rosa, and me. The little house was too small for us. We all slept crammed together. But we were happy. Mornings were chaotic with crying children, boiling coffee, and Rosa running back and forth preparing lunches and uniforms. But construction was paying less and less, and the bills were piling up. A kilo of beans that used to cost 3 pesos now cost 8. Milk for the children, medicine when they got sick, school supplies. Everything went up in price every month. I started working in the afternoons doing plumbing and electrical jobs, anything that would pay me a few extra pesos. On Sundays, our only day off, we would go to the river with the children. Rosa would pack tortillas, quesadillas, and hibiscus tea in a rusty thermos, and we would sit on the big rocks and watch the children play in the shallow water. Miguel Jr. already knew how to swim like a fish, and he teased Esperanza because she was afraid to get her face wet. Dad, Miguel Jr., who was 6 at the time, asked me one Sunday, "Why does Mr. Ricardo have a car and we don't?" I didn't know how to answer him. Ricardo was a man who had worked in the United States and had returned to the village with enough money to buy a pickup truck and build a 2-story house. His children went to private school in Uruapan, and his wife wore dresses she bought in Morelia. "Because we have other things that are more important, son," I said. But my own answer sounded hollow. That night, lying next to Rosa, who was sleeping with Carlos in her arms, I thought about my son's question. Outside, I could hear the crickets and the distant barking of dogs, and I wondered if my children would have to settle for going to the river on Sundays for the rest of their lives, while other children had toys and opportunities that I couldn't give them. The idea of going to the United States began as a ghost that visited me at night when I couldn't sleep because of my worries. At first, I scared it away, telling myself that I wasn't one of those men who abandoned their families, that my place was here with Rosa and the children, working honestly at whatever job I could find. But the ghost returned every time I couldn't pay the bills, every time I had to tell Rosa we couldn't buy meat that week, every time Esperanza asked me for a doll and I had to make up excuses. The real change began when Carlos came down with pneumonia at the age of 2. It was the December holidays. It was freezing cold, and the boy started coughing like an old motor. Rosa took him to the health center, but the doctor only prescribed a cheap syrup that didn't cure his cough. Within 3 days, Carlos was burning up with fever and breathing as if he were drowning. We carried him to the hospital in Uruapan, running through the streets because we didn't have money for a taxi. Rosa cried as she carried the child, and my heart broke to see my little boy struggling to breathe. He needs to be hospitalized, the doctor told us after examining him, and special antibiotics that cost 1,500 pesos. 1,500 pesos. That was more than I earned in a month. I stood there like a fool in the hospital hallway that smelled of disinfectant and sadness, listening to my son cry and feeling like I was useless as a father. "Doctor," I said, "isn't there any cheaper medicine?" He looked at me with a mixture of compassion and annoyance. "Sir, your son is very serious. If we don't admit him today, he could get much worse." I had to borrow money from my dad, my brothers, my friend Rodolfo, and everyone I knew. I finally got the money together. But it took me 6 months to pay it all back. 6 months of eating nothing but beans and tortillas. 6 months of feeling like I was drowning in debt. Carlos was saved, thank God. But something broke inside me during those days in the hospital. Seeing my son hooked up to those machines, listening to Rosa cry softly in the plastic chair where she spent 3 sleepless nights, I realized that love wasn't enough. That no matter how much I loved my family, it wasn't going to give them what they needed. It was my compadre Rodolfo who first spoke to me seriously about the North. He had returned 2 years earlier after working for 5 years in California, and he had built a nice house, started an auto parts business, and his children were going to a good school. "Miguel," he said one afternoon as we were drinking beer in his backyard, "you can make real money out there. Sure, it's hard, you suffer, but in 5 years you can make more than you'll ever make here in your whole life." "But being away from your family," I began. "It's temporary, buddy. I sent home $500 every month, $500 that was like 4,000 pesos here. My wife was able to finish building the house. The kids never went without anything. And when I came back, we had money saved to start a business. That night I mentioned it to Rosa while we were lying in bed. The children were asleep in the next room, and I could hear their peaceful breathing, so different from when Carlos had been sick. "Go north?" Rosa asked me, her voice sounding worried. "For how long?" "I don't know, my love. 2 years, maybe 3. Long enough to save up for a house of our own, so the kids can get a good education, so we never have to go through what we went through with Carlos." Rosa was silent for a long time. Then I felt her turn toward me in the darkness. "Miguel, I'm scared. I'm scared you'll leave and never come back, like Comadre Estela. Her husband left 10 years ago and only came back once for his mother's funeral. I'm not like him, Rosa. I'll come back, I promise." But deep down, I knew it was a promise I might not be able to keep. I had heard too many stories of men who left for 2 years and stayed away forever, of families that broke up and never got back together again. I spent 3 months mulling it over. Every day I changed my mind. In the mornings, when I saw Rosa preparing breakfast with the few ingredients we had, I convinced myself that I had to leave. In the afternoons, when I came home and the children ran to hug me, I convinced myself that I had to stay. I made the final decision one day when Miguel Jr. came home from school crying because his classmates had made fun of his broken shoes. He was 8 years old, and between sobs, he explained that the teacher had said that parents who couldn't buy their children good shoes were lazy. That night, after Rosa fell asleep, I got up and went out to the backyard. It was cold, and the stars were shining brighter than I had ever seen them. I sat down on the wooden chair my dad had made for me, and there, under the sky I had seen all my life, I made the most difficult decision of my life. I was going to go north. I was going to leave my family for a while so I could give them a better future. It was the only way to break the cycle of poverty we were trapped in. The next day, I told Rosa over breakfast, while the children ate tortillas with refried beans. "I've made up my mind," I said. "I'm going to the United States." Rosa stopped stirring the beans in the pan. The children continued eating, unaware that their world was about to change forever. "When?" Rosa asked without looking at me. "In 2 months. I need to save money for the trip and to leave something here while I find work there." Rosa didn't speak to me that day, but at night, when we were lying in bed, I heard her crying softly. I didn't say anything. I just held her, and I cried silently too, knowing that I was about to break my own life into pieces in the hope of building something better. Finding a coyote wasn't as hard as I thought. Everyone in town knew who did that kind of thing, although no one talked about it openly. They directed me to Don Jacinto, an older man who had a blacksmith shop and disappeared on weekends without explaining where he was going. Don Jacinto was skinny as a rail, with a gray mustache and hands marked by burns from hot iron. His workshop smelled of burnt coal and metal, and the sound of the hammer on the anvil could be heard from early morning until sunset. "So, you want to cross?" he said without looking up from the piece of iron he was working on. "Do you have family there?" "No, sir. I'm going to look for work. It'll cost 25,000 pesos. 15 now. 10 when you arrive safely on the other side. 25,000 pesos. It was a fortune to me, almost 2 years' work. But Don Jacinto had a reputation for being serious, for getting his people to their destination, unlike other coyotes who sometimes disappeared with the money and left people stranded in the desert. "When would that be?" I asked him. "The next group leaves in 6 weeks. I'll give you the address of a house in Tijuana where you'll wait for instructions. From there, we'll take you to a safe place to cross." That afternoon, I started selling everything I owned. I sold my bicycle, which I had bought secondhand but worked well, to my friend Rodolfo for 1,000 pesos. I sold the tools I'd collected over years of work to Don Aurelio for 3,000. I pawned my watch, a citizen that Rosa had given me for our anniversary, for 500 pesos that I knew I would never be able to get back. Rosa helped me without saying a word, but I saw a sadness in her eyes that broke my heart. When I sold our radio, the only entertainment we had at night, she stood in the kitchen looking at the empty space where it had been, and I had to leave the house because I couldn't bear to see her like that. "Why don't we sell the bed too?" she said to me one day with a bitter smile. "After all, what do we need it for if you're leaving?" I didn't know what to say. Everything I sold was like tearing a piece of my life away, but I needed the money. I borrowed from my dad, my brothers, everyone I knew who could help me. My dad gave me the 3,000 pesos he had saved to fix the roof of his house. "Son," he said when he gave me the money, "take care of yourself, and don't forget where you came from." "I won't forget, Dad." But there was something in his eyes, a deep sadness, as if he knew that things would never be the same again. The weeks flew by and dragged on at the same time. The days seemed endless because I couldn't concentrate on my work. But the nights flew by because I knew that each one brought me closer to the moment of my departure. I started collecting memories, as if I were going to die. The smell of Rosa's hair when she lay down next to me. The sound of Esperanza's laughter when she played in the yard. The way Miguel Jr. frowned when he did his math homework. The weight of Carlos in my arms when he fell asleep watching TV. 2 weeks before I left, Rosa told me she was pregnant again. She told me on a Sunday afternoon as we sat in the yard watching the kids play with some chicks my mother-in-law had bought. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink, and there was a peace we hadn't felt in weeks. "Miguel," she said suddenly, "I have something to tell you." From the way she said it, I knew immediately what it was about. Rosa had that expression she'd had the other 3 times, a mixture of happiness and fear that shone in her eyes. "When?" I asked. "I think 2 months. It's due in November." I was silent for a long time, feeling as if I had been punched in the stomach. Another child, another mouth to feed, another responsibility, but also another reason to work hard, to not fail. "What are we going to do?" Rosa asked, and there was a plea in her voice. "The same as we planned," I said, even though the words hurt when they came out. "I'll go, work hard, and send money so you'll be okay. So this baby will have everything it needs." Rosa nodded, but tears began to roll down her cheeks. I hugged her, feeling her body tremble against mine, and I cried too, because I knew I was going to miss the pregnancy, the birth, the first months of my child's life. "It's going to be a girl," Rosa told me through her tears. "I can feel it here," she said, touching her belly. "Now what are we going to name her?" "Esperanza," she said without hesitation. "Like my mother-in-law, so she'll be lucky." But we already had an Esperanza, our 6-year-old daughter. "Rosa, we already have an Esperanza." "Then Esperanza Maria," said Rosa. "So she'll know that her dad loved her before she was born, even though he wasn't here." The last week was torture. Every moment felt like goodbye. Every word could be the last I said to my children before I left. I tried to act normal, not to scare them, but they sensed that something was happening. "Dad," Esperanza asked me one night as I was tucking her in, "why is my mom sad?" "She's not sad, sweetheart. She's just a little tired." "Are you going to get tired too?" I was speechless. Children see everything, feel everything, even if you try to hide things from them. "Esperanza," I said, sitting on her bed and holding her little hands, "Daddy has to go on a trip for a while. But I'll think about you every day, and I'll send you letters." "A long trip?" "Yes, my love. But I'll come back, I promise." Esperanza hugged my neck and kissed me on the cheek, which smelled of baby soap and innocence. "Bring me something nice," she said. "I'll bring you the nicest thing I can find," I promised, not knowing that that promise would haunt me for years. With Miguel Jr., it was more difficult because he was already 9 years old and understood more. One afternoon, 3 days before I left, he asked me directly, "Dad, are you going to the United States like Ramon's dad?" Ramon was a schoolmate whose father had left for the North 2 years earlier and had not returned. He only sent money from time to time, and Ramon was always sad. "Yes, son. But I'm coming back." "Why do you have to go?" "Because I can earn more money there so you can have better things, so you can go to a good school." Miguel Jr. thought about it for a while, with that seriousness that sometimes scared me in such a young child. "Dad," he finally said, "I don't want better things. I love you." It broke my heart. I hugged him tight, breathing in the scent of his hair, memorizing the weight of his small body against mine. "I love you too, son. That's why I'm leaving, so I can give you everything you deserve." But as I said those words, I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if the money was worth the price we were all going to pay. With Carlos, it was different because he was only 3 years old and didn't understand what was happening. He just knew that Mom was crying a lot and that Dad was acting strange. He stuck to me like glue, as if he sensed that something bad was going to happen. "Dad," he would say every few minutes, pulling on my shirt. "Dad, Dad, Dad," as if my name were a prayer that would calm him down. The day before I left, Rosa and I went for a walk by the river, alone, while my mother-in-law looked after the children. It was a Sunday in February. It was cold, and the water was flowing faster because it had rained in the mountains. We sat on the big rock where we had had our first date, where I had told her I loved her, where we had planned our whole life together. The sound of the water running was the only thing we could hear, except for the birds singing in the trees. "Miguel," Rosa said, taking my hand, "I'm scared." "I'm scared too, my love. What if something happens to you on the way? What if you don't find a job? What if you forget about us?" "I will never forget you. You are my life, Rosa. Everything I am, everything I do, is for you." Rosa cried silently, and I cried too, because I knew this was more than a temporary goodbye. It was the end of an era, the end of the family we had built together. "Promise me something," Rosa said. "Anything. Promise me that if you can't come back in 2 years, you'll send for me. That we'll all go together to be with you." "I promise," I said. And at that moment I believed I would be able to keep it. That night we made love for the last time, as the complete family we were. Rosa held me all night, and I lay awake feeling her breath on my neck, memorizing the warmth of her body, storing in my soul the feeling of being home. The day of my departure dawned gray and cold. I got up before dawn, took a cold shower, and dressed in the clothes I had set aside for the trip. Jeans, a denim shirt, sturdy boots, and a jacket my brother had lent me. Rosa prepared lunch for me to take with me. Refried bean tacos, hibiscus tea in a plastic bottle, and milk candies she had made especially for me. She wrapped everything in a plastic bag as carefully as if it were a treasure. The children woke up to say goodbye. Miguel Jr. gave me a drawing he had made of our family, all holding hands in front of our house. Esperanza gave me a little rock she had painted red. So you won't forget me. Carlos hugged my legs and didn't want to let go. I have to go now, I said. But my voice broke. Rosa picked up Carlos so I could walk away. The 3 children followed me to the door, and I turned around one last time to see them standing there, small and vulnerable, trusting that their dad was going to do the right thing. Take care of yourselves, I shouted from the street. I love you. We love you too, Miguel Jr. shouted. I walked toward the main road without looking back, because I knew that if I saw their little faces again, I wouldn't have the courage to leave. The truck that was going to take me to Tijuana arrived on time, its old engine roaring and spewing black smoke. I got in with my small backpack containing my entire life, a change of clothes, a photo of my family, some papers, and the 15,000 pesos I had saved to pay the coyote. The truck smelled of diesel and the sweat of other men who, like me, were leaving everything behind in search of a better future. As the truck drove away from the town, I saw through the window the hills where I had played as a child, the church where I had gotten married, the streets where I had walked all my life. Everything grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared, and I sat there with a broken heart, but with the hope that one day I would return to rebuild what I was breaking. The trip to Tijuana took 16 hours in a rickety truck that stopped every hour to pick up more passengers. We were packed in like sardines, and the smell of food, sweat, and nerves filled the air. Most of us were young men with the same look of determination and fear, the same dream of crossing to the other side to change our lives. At dusk, we arrived in Tijuana, a city that seemed gigantic and chaotic to me, full of cars, noise, and people running from one place to another. The air smelled different, heavier, with a metallic taste that stuck in my throat. The address Don Jacinto had given me was for a small house in a neighborhood that looked dangerous, with unpaved streets and tin houses stuck together. I knocked on the rusty door, and a fat woman chewing gum opened it and looked me up and down. "Are you here to see Jacinto?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Come in. You'll be here for 2 days while we organize the group." The house smelled of refried beans and beer. There were 6 other men waiting, some very young, others older, all with the same anxious expression. We slept on mattresses on the floor, ate what we were given, and were not allowed to leave. 2 days later, at dawn, the coyote arrived. The coyote was named after a high school teacher in his town. The professor didn't talk much, but when he did, we all listened carefully. He had a calmness that reassured us, as if he knew that no matter what happened, he was in control of his nerves. El Flaco checked our backpacks. As he did so, he gave specific instructions. No running around like crazy if you hear helicopters. Get down on the ground and wait for my signal. If someone twists an ankle, we leave them behind. Those are the rules. No one risks the group. Before we left, I had a moment to call my mother. I didn't know if I would ever hear her voice again. "I'm about to cross. I whispered, trembling. God be with you, my son, she replied. Just that, her voice breaking as it had when she saw me sick as a child. I imagined the faces of Carmen and Letitia, and I hugged my mother's words as if they could protect me from the cold desert that awaited me outside. We left just before dawn, with the moon still high, bathing the desert in a white, almost unreal light. The air smelled of dry earth, of succulent plants beaten by centuries of heat. With every step I took, I heard the gravel crunching under my new boots and felt the rough rub of my backpack on my shoulders, burned by the previous day's sun. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the wind rustling the branches of the bushes and the muffled whispers of my group. Every shadow made us think of the migra. Every time we thought we saw strange movements, our hearts raced like frightened horses. I thought, maybe that shadow is me, running away from my past, running towards something I can't see. The walk was endless. We drank water only when the professor, who counted the minutes in silence, told us to. We marched and rested, alternating between light and shadow, paranoid that at any moment we might hear the unmistakable sound of sirens or helicopters. I saw people fall, heard muffled sobs, felt hope ache in my bones. I remembered my father saying at Mass in my village, "Every pain has its purpose." I repeated the phrase over and over in my mind so as not to succumb. Finally, after hours that felt like years, we crossed a rusty fence. "You're on the other side now," El Flaco whispered, as if he didn't want to wake the ghosts of the desert. The air on the U.S. side smelled the same, of earth and cactus. But there was something different, an electricity in the air, as if the landscape itself knew that we had just been reborn as illegal immigrants, invisible. They made us wait for almost 2 hours, motionless among the bushes, until a dusty pickup truck, driven by a man who didn't say a word, arrived. We got in, half dead from thirst, and rode huddled together, not daring to look out the windows. The first "Welcome to California" sign made me smile and cry at the same time. I touched it through the filthy window, thinking, I made it. Now the sacrifice begins. The safe house in San Diego was an anonymous dwelling in a neighborhood that smelled of the sea and cheap hamburgers. The place was crowded with people, thin mattresses strewn on the floor, supermarket bags full of clothes and used shoes. The air was thick with the mixed aromas of sweat, cheap disinfectant, and stale instant coffee. The hum of an old refrigerator competed with the buzz of conversations in different accents and idioms. The television was on all day, showing Mexican soap operas, a reminder that we weren't from here yet. In the background, men played dominoes, banging the tiles fiercely. Their voices were low, but full of anxiety. Those who had just arrived cried at night, calling their mothers or wives on borrowed cell phones, knowing that every call was a risk. The first breakfast was bread with butter and American coffee at room temperature. I ate slowly, as if it were a delicacy, imagining the taste of my mother's mole or the rice pudding we had on birthdays. Everything tasted different. The bread was too sweet, the coffee was watery, and strangely, I was filled with nostalgia for little things I hadn't even noticed before. As soon as I could, I called Carmen using the boss's phone. My voice was shaking, but when I heard her say, "Rodrigo, is that you? Did you make it across?" I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Yes, my love, I'm fine. I'll be in New York soon, and I'll look for work." On the other end of the line, her sobs pierced my heart. She asked me not to take any risks, to think of us. I didn't know what else to promise beyond the usual. I'm doing this for you. That afternoon, I met Nacho, a fellow countryman from Guerrero who offered to take me to Los Angeles by truck for $100. We spent the whole night traveling. The truck creaked with every bump, and no one spoke. A baby cried under blankets, his father praying desperately in a low voice. We were united by fear, hope, and above all, the certainty that there was no turning back. Arriving in Los Angeles was another shock. The heat, the smells of tacos and gasoline, the shouts in Spanish mixed with English. For me, every sign was an indecipherable code. Every phrase in English reminded you that you were a stranger. I stayed with a group of people from Michoacán in a damp house, where we shared a 3x3 room between 6 of us, in exchange for $80 a week per person. I spent the first day walking the streets, looking for any kind of work. No one knew you. No one said, "Good morning, Rodrigo." I missed the familiarity of my town and the warmth of the greetings, but I hid it as I had learned as a child. I was invisible, just one more among thousands of invisible people. That's how my real years of struggle began, learning to get by in a country where my name no longer carried any weight, where my entire worth was measured by the number of hours I could work. The smell of detergent, the endless sound of traffic, the taste of new foods or foods remade with nostalgia. That's where I began my life as an illegal, knowing that there was a huge difference between crossing a border and truly belonging to the country you arrived in. And yet, those days were only the foundation for everything else that would come. Because the hardest part wasn't getting there. It was surviving, clinging only to hope, memory, and the promise, still broken, that everything had meaning. The first few weeks in Los Angeles were pure survival. Every day, I woke up with my body aching from sleeping on a thin mattress shared with 2 others. And I got up before dawn because the only bathroom in the house filled up quickly, and no one wanted to show up at work dirty. The water in the shower was always cold. And the smell of damp mixed with soap and sweat was the first thing I noticed when I woke up. In the kitchen, which was more like a hallway with an old stove and a plastic table covered with chipped cups, we all fought over instant coffee. There was always a pot of refried beans left over from the night before, bread from the Mexican bakery on the corner, and, if someone had gotten paid, eggs. There, half asleep, I listened to old corridos on cell phones and the hurried cries of "hurry up" from those who didn't want to miss the bus. I got the job thanks to Nacho, a fellow countryman. He had been working for a demolition crew for some time and convinced the foreman to give me a try. It was rare in those days, 2001, for them to accept people without papers. But it wasn't impossible. The boss, Jerry, a big red-haired white man, only communicated by shouting, "You, yes, you, shovel here." I quickly learned that the important thing was not to stand still. If they saw you standing for more than a minute, they would yell at you, or worse, send you home without pay. The first day was hell. My hands, legs, and neck hurt. I scraped walls with a shovel and threw debris into the truck under a sun that burned my skin like chili peppers. Dust got into my nose and eyes. My new boots gave me blisters. However, when evening came, and Jerry put $80 in crumpled bills in my hand, I felt something like pride. I did it, I thought. I survived the first day. That smell of money and sweat stayed with me. It was the first small victory of many defeats. After a week, my routine was clear. Get up at 5 a.m., fight for the shower, grab some bread and beans, run after the bus at the corner, work like a dog for 12 hours, come home exhausted, eat whatever there was, and fall asleep without the strength to talk. I missed Carmen and my family very much. Phone calls were expensive, so I could only call very early on Sundays when phone cards gave you more minutes. Sometimes I heard my daughter Anna's voice, sometimes just Carmen's worried whispers telling me, "I miss you. Everything is still the same here. Be careful." I responded with white lies. "Everything is fine here. We're getting better." Every Sunday, Nacho and I would walk to the little market in Placita Olvera. Among the stalls selling sweaters, images of the Virgin Mary, and piles of steaming tortillas, I felt a little closer to Michoacán. I would buy dried chilies, even though I couldn't afford meat, just to smell the spicy powder and remember my mother's mole. Sometimes Nacho would sit with me on a bench in the sun and tell me how he had crossed Arizona and almost died of thirst, or how his wife back in Guerrero no longer answered his phone calls. "Distance kills love, buddy," he would say. "At first you miss them, you cry. Then you just get used to it, and that's the worst part." My roommates came and went. Some went north to find better pay in vineyards or on farms. Omar, a paisa from Veracruz, was arrested for drunk driving, and we never heard from him again. Another, Julio from Sinaloa, learned English so well in 2 years that he even started working in the kitchen of a fancy restaurant, as he put it. The nights were long and sometimes lonely, the only consolation being the old TV where we watched Mexican soccer, although the picture was sometimes double, and the pirated cable always failed. When I finally saved enough, I started sending money every 2 weeks. At Western Union, my hands shook as I filled out the form, writing Carmen's name with hope clenched in my stomach. In line, people talked about everything. Whether the dollar had gone up, whether the PRI had fallen, whether the migra was now worse. I listened anxiously, trying to understand the new world of the migrant, one where money travels, but hugs do not. My children's birthdays, Anna's communion, news of my father's illness reached me through calls I waited weeks for. The sound of my mother's voice, sad, resigned, broke my heart. Once, for Carmen's birthday, I recorded a cassette tape with my voice and serenades downloaded from the radio, and sent it to her. She told me later, crying, that when she heard my voice, she felt as if I were at the door, about to return. But I knew that recorded hug would never be enough. Over the months, small changes began to take place. The language, at first incomprehensible, became a daily challenge. I enrolled in night English classes at a Methodist church, where a retired Texan lady, Miss Linda, taught us with eccentric patience. "Repeat after me. Where is the bathroom?" We repeated each phrase like parrots, laughing at our mistakes because laughing was less painful than accepting frustration. After 6 months, I could say, "I want a job. I am Rodrigo," and ask for directions without stuttering so much. The day a gringo asked me for help carrying some boxes and I understood half of what he said, I felt powerful, as if I had crossed another invisible border. On the construction site, changes were slower. I went from being one of the laborers who carried rubble to one who learned to read simple blueprints, distinguish types of concrete, and use industrial drills. When Jerry started giving me slightly more complex tasks, I felt that my efforts were paying off. I became friends with some of my co-workers. Manuel, a quiet Salvadoran who taught me how to lay tiles without them moving, and Luis from Sonora, with whom I ate head tacos on street corners after work. At home, the rituals began to change. I no longer prayed the rosary every night, but I did keep Sunday as a special day. I washed clothes by hand, cooked rice and chicken my mother's way, and spoke to the Virgin Mary in a low voice, asking her to keep me strong. Sometimes nostalgia hit me like a hangover after a party. And then I would set off aimlessly through the streets full of graffiti, ice cream vendors, the smell of hot asphalt, and Valentina sauce dripping from potato chip bags. I started sending more money to Carmen as my pay improved. Sometimes I sent $100, sometimes $200, while everything there was going up in price. One day my wife told me, "We have enough to fix the roof before the rains. The children are fine. Miguel is doing better in school." I was filled with a sad pride. I worked myself to exhaustion, but what weighed most heavily on me was not being able to be there. The money was good, yes, but it didn't hug them at night, it didn't cure fevers, it didn't give advice during adolescence. Eventually, I moved to New York to seek a better future, invited by a distant cousin. Another move, another shared apartment, new smells. Here more like pizza and curry than tacos and tamarind. Just like before, it was all starting from scratch. Looking for jobs, learning new subway lines, eating only what I could afford. The cold of the first winter froze me to the bone. Even under 3 jackets, I missed the sun of Michoacán. As an illegal immigrant, every day was an act of invisibility. Going to work without being noticed, not responding if someone heard your accent, learning to look down when you saw a patrol car. The fear of the Migro was constant. You would see someone detained at the supermarket, and the rumor would spread quickly. "They're hunting, watch out." I learned not to trust much, to speak little, and to work twice as hard. Sometimes at night, I dreamed of my mother's voice and Carmen's tamales. I would wake up to the murmur of the heater and the distant roar of the sleepless city. Amid all that chaos, I got into the habit of always carrying a calendar. I marked the days I sent money home in red. The dates of long calls home were in green. Anniversaries, birthdays, and saints' days were in blue. It was my way of not losing myself, of staying connected, even if only through lines of ink, to the life I left behind. Sometimes, on Sundays, I would go to Mass at St. Patrick's Church, where there were more Latinos than Irish, and I would stand among all those migrants with similar stories. I would see the candles, smell the incense, hear the echo of the prayers, and feel that for a moment we were all together, embraced by hope, longing, fear, and faith. It was there that I began to notice that, although I had managed to bring my family to this country, they were adapting more quickly, gradually pulling away from me. My children learned perfect English, made American friends, and dreamed of things I didn't even understand. Carmen, at first shy and dependent, eventually found strength by working and speaking English better than I did. One day she came home laughing because her co-workers had invited her to dinner, and I couldn't go with her because neither she nor I wanted them to notice my accent. My children only spoke Spanish to me. I saw how they corrected me without meaning to. "You don't say park, Dad, you say park." I felt like I was being left behind, slowly becoming the illegal who was only useful for bringing home money, always out of touch with the new codes and customs of my own home. Amid nostalgia, new challenges, good days, and bad days, I found myself wondering every night if it had been worth losing so much to gain so little, and if on the road to a better life, I wasn't left with only my shadow and hope. Over the years, my relationship with my family changed from something warm and everyday to an increasingly distant correspondence, as if each call were thrown across an ocean of time and not just miles. At first, the conversations were long, full of plans, confidences, and nervous laughter. Carmen told me even the smallest details. If Anna had gotten an A in school, if Miguel had sprained his ankle playing soccer, if the neighbor's dog was making noise in the early morning. I responded with anecdotes about the construction site, my co-workers, the gringos who spoke fast and didn't say hello. But little by little, the tone of the calls changed. I would dial with excitement, but sometimes Carmen would answer between activities, washing, cooking, preparing something for her English classes. The teenage children answered with monosyllables, distracted by the TV or their phones. Did you send the money for school supplies? Will you be able to pay the rent this month? The urgency of everyday life invaded every last corner of our affection. I clearly remember one afternoon when I called just to hear Miguel say with annoyance, "Dad, I have homework. I'll talk to you later." I heard laughter in English in the background and the slam of his bedroom door. I stared at the phone, measuring the gulf between me, the unconditional provider, and that son who was already living in a different world. Even so, every 2 weeks I religiously went to Western Union. I sent the money, kept the receipt as if it were a good luck charm, and called to let them know the exact amount. At home, it became routine. "How much came this week, Dad?" Carmen was already organizing the household finances without consulting me. I began to realize that my authority, my voice, was fading. I was the useful man, the one who solved problems from afar, the one who was always there, but never present. The big dates were the cruelest. Birthdays, Christmas, Mother's Day. I sent audio messages, trying to make it special. I remember the first Christmas together in the U.S. when I finally managed to bring them over. I wanted to resume the old rituals. Mass, chocolate with bread, a simple but loving dinner, but everything was strange now. Anna preferred pizza. Miguel only wanted video games. Carmen couldn't find the ingredients for the punch, and the snow outside made them long for the warmth of Michoacan. Sitting in the living room, me seeing the effort they were making to adapt on their faces, them looking at me with affection, but also with strangeness, I felt, for the first time, that time had changed us too much and too quickly. I tried hard to keep up traditions, making mole on Sundays, playing Vicente Fernandez music, speaking only Spanish at home. But my children felt more and more comfortable in English, asking for hamburgers, laughing at dad jokes, no longer aware of the pain of being the children of immigrants. It was Miguel who one day, without even looking at me, blurted out, "No one here says que milagro." "What a miracle, Dad, that's weird." The comment hurt me more than I admitted. Meanwhile, life was taking its toll. Years of hard work, punctual payments, painful silences. I saw fellow countrymen start businesses. Some friends grow, and others lose themselves to alcohol or depression. One neighbor went to Mexico to bury his father and was unable to return. Another, frightened by raids, cut off all communication and became nothing more than a sad rumor. As time went by, my children stopped being the Mexicans' kids and became simply the Hernandezes at school. And Carmen rose through the ranks, mastering English and making Latina and American friends. I felt proud and invisible at the same time. The most powerful moment was the day Anna, after graduating from high school, said to me, "Dad, I want to go to college outside of New York. I want to be like my friends." Pride and fear fought inside me. Pride in seeing her fly, fear of not knowing how we would sustain ourselves without our family routine. Carmen defended her decision. "Let her go, Rodrigo." We can't clip her wings just because you had a different destiny. That night, alone in my room, I looked at old photos and listened to audio recordings of my mother before she died. I wondered if I had caused her similar pain when I left home. Is it the fate of the migrants to always be on the sidelines, always in transit, never at the center? I reflected long and hard on the meaning of so much sacrifice. Was it worth losing moments, hugs, stories, to see them adapt to a country that I found so difficult to accept as my own? Sometimes, my only consolation was remembering when I arrived in the U.S. with them and saw them marvel at the snow, the music in another language, the Christmas lights on the skyscrapers. When Anna took my hand to cross the street in traffic and looked at me with admiration, it was as if, at least then, they still needed me. The years also brought physical and mental wear and tear. Work hurt my back and knees. I could no longer carry as much or work double shifts. The nightmares got worse. Sometimes I dreamed of falling from buildings, of being chased by the immigration police. Other times of the silence of an empty house. The ailments began: chest pain, insomnia, gastritis. But the fear of losing what little I had achieved was stronger than caution. I didn't go to the doctor even when Carmen begged me to. "We don't have insurance," I said, "and everything costs money here." The loneliness became more acute when my children left home. Soon, even Carmen became a distant figure. We talked more about bills and needs than about affection, like two partners in a tired business. Weeks went by when we barely exchanged a few words after dinner. I was silent with sadness and exhaustion. She was restless, always driven by new goals. It was during one of my worst moments that life shook me to my core. A small, silent heart attack as I was walking down the stairs at work. Fortunately, it was minor. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and fear. The bill hurt more than the recovery. Carmen, frightened, hugged me tightly on the stretcher. For the first time in years, we cried together in silence. There, lying with wires on my chest, I thought about everything. The nights away from home, the relentless sacrifice, my children becoming Americans, my self-sufficient wife, and me becoming a stranger in my own reflection. Was that the price of seeking a better life? Or was it just the inevitable cycle of growth, grief, and reinvention to which we migrants are condemned? My personality changed. I became quieter, sometimes irritable. Fear and nostalgia turned into a quiet sadness. Many Sundays I preferred to go for long walks in the park, trying to find meaning among the greenery, the birds, and the children playing in English. I missed the warmth of the village, the familiar noise of open kitchens and old radios playing ranchera music. Here, there was only the distant murmur of my language, and the certainty that, no matter how much my family progressed, I was still tied to the same role I had always had, the one that only serves to work. The breaking point came during a particularly cold winter. Everyone, even Carmen, had papers, and I was the only one who was afraid of the unexpected doorbell, of a raid, of having my documents checked on any street corner. My children no longer even asked about my immigration status. They took it for granted that I would always be the useful, undocumented immigrant, almost a shadow in our American family life. One night, after an argument about money, Anna's scholarship didn't cover everything. Miguel needed help for college. I exploded. I shouted things I didn't even know I had inside me. Am I only good for paying bills? Does it matter who I am outside of this job? The silence was thick. Carmen looked at me with a mixture of fear and sadness. That's not why we need you, Rodrigo. But I don't know who you are anymore when you don't pay or work. You pushed us away yourself. You clung so tightly to carrying everything that you didn't know how to let us live with you, not just thanks to you. I slept little that night. In addition to the physical pain, I felt a deep pressure in my chest, as if all the years of effort were now just a heavy stone that no one else shared. Hours later, alone in the living room, I picked up the phone and called Anna's voicemail. I recorded a long message, as if I were talking to the child I once was. I told him how proud I was, that life in the United States was hard but beautiful. The people here changed, and that one must also know how to change. I asked him for forgiveness for not knowing how to let go and trust, for fearing the future. After that night, my body felt heavier every morning. It wasn't just physical pain. It was a listlessness that came from the soul. I started working fewer hours. Sometimes I pretended to be on shift just to stay home alone, watching the dust drift through the light from the window, listening to the murmur of the city behind the glass. The clock seemed to mock me, moving slowly when I tried to distract myself and racing by when I found a moment of calm. I found myself withdrawing from my family. Carmen talked to me several times about seeking therapy. People here ask for help, Rodrigo. It's not crazy. But for me, raised among the silence of men who endure everything, sharing my inner turmoil was almost a betrayal of the character I believed to be essential. Alone, I would sit before the altar of the Virgin and whisper disconnected words, asking for comfort and some sign. Faith was a distant beacon, sometimes an excuse to cry in the darkness without fear of judgment. The nights were filled with insomnia. My thoughts went round and round in circles. I remembered my parents at the adobe table, my mother's words, "You can only take what fits in your heart to the north." I thought about what I had left behind. A sun-filled courtyard, friends with whom I now only exchanged terse messages every Christmas, and above all, that fearless youth. The illusion of being able to do anything. I asked myself over and over again, what if I had decided to stay? What if I had accepted the small life Mexico offered me in exchange for always being surrounded by my loved ones? I rediscovered the habit of writing. Although hesitant, I began to fill old notebooks with anecdotes, names, pains, and broken dreams. Sometimes I found myself crying as I wrote memories of my young children, of Anna calling me Dad, of Miguel asking me to help him tie his shoes. Or I described the smell of the kitchen on holidays, Carmen's hug when it was still new to us to lean on each other in times of crisis. I approached the church and a group of migrant men who gathered weekly to talk. It was hard for me to break the silence. But as I listened to stories similar to mine, I felt less ashamed. A man named Vicente recounted, through tears, how his daughter got married without inviting him. Not out of malice, she says, but so as not to complicate my status. Another, Marco, spoke of the guilt of letting his mother die far away, just to have the opportunity to send dollars that never hugged her. Among that club of broken and persistent people, I understood that my story was part of a larger chorus, a constellation of lives sacrificed to the God of hope. I reviewed the years, one by one. What did I gain? What did I lose? I gained a half-finished house, an education for my children, material peace of mind. I lost birthdays, kisses, the complete trust of my loved ones, the sense of belonging beyond four walls. Loneliness was the price no one tells you you'll pay when you decide to migrate. My mind, once closed to the future, began to open up. I asked myself what I really wanted. To go back to Mexico? Impossible. The children were already American. Carmen had her life established. My friends had grown old or died. Stop working so hard? Maybe. But then what? For the first time, I saw my life as a gift that I could still enjoy, even if it wasn't the package I had asked for in my youth. One morning, after much thought, I picked up an English book and enrolled, this time for real, in a night class for adults. Sitting with people of all ages, I repeated aloud words that I had previously only murmured. I challenged myself to go out alone for a coffee, to respond in English even if I was corrected. I felt afraid, yes, but also a spark of childish pride. "It's never too late," Miss Linda repeated in class, and I began to believe it. Talking to Carmen, after years of only talking about money and problems, we finally talked about life. I told her how I felt, how lost and alienated. She listened without judging, just like in the early years. Then she took my hand and said, "I felt that way too, Rodrigo. Only here, women speak up. Talk more. Don't stay alone." I also sought professional help, as Carmen suggested. It was hard at first, sitting in front of someone and talking about my fears, my broken dreams, my feelings of failure. But with each session, I felt the knot in my chest loosen. I learned to forgive myself, to understand that I wasn't betraying my father or Mexico by seeking some peace in my adopted country. I talked to Ana and Miguel, now adults. Ana hugged me tightly, cried with me, and said, "Dad, I always felt you were far away, but I always knew you loved me. I don't want you to be alone anymore." Miguel, for the first time in years, sat down next to me, and we talked for a long time. I told him about my first job, the friends I had lost, everything I had kept quiet for fear of appearing weak in front of them. There were many possible paths. Seek citizenship, even if it took time and money. Finally devote myself to something less demanding. Try volunteering to help new immigrants. Write my story. Pick up the guitar I had left behind in Mexico. I did the math, made simple plans, and decided not to run away from what I had, but to try to live it as best I could. I told my boss that I would no longer work overtime, that I would leave the dangerous jobs to the young people. I was afraid of having less income, but Carmen and I reorganized our budget. I started taking her and the kids to museums, parks, and experiences beyond work and television. I dared to speak at meetings, to tell my story, even with my accent and mistakes. One day I was invited to give a talk to new immigrants. I spoke to them simply. Don't lose yourselves. Learn, ask questions, cry, but don't keep quiet like I did. The American dream is not worth your silence or your loneliness. Your effort is worth it, but so is your well-being and your happiness. At the end, several people came up to me to thank me for opening my heart. For the first time in many years, I felt that I too belonged here. At night, I resumed the habit of writing letters, some to Mexico, even though no one responds, and cooking for my family, trying new recipes, sometimes surprising them, sometimes making them laugh at my mistakes. My bond with Ana and Miguel grew. I learned to talk to them not as a provider, but as a father who listens, admits his mistakes, and lets himself be hugged. I looked at Carmen and saw her again as a partner, not as a forced accomplice in an endless battle. We laughed at our clumsiness, cried over what we had lost, and dreamed together in small ways. To travel someday, just the two of us. Maybe return to the village for a month to say goodbye to what we once were. I have accepted that identity is not a fixed point, but a current in which one must learn to swim. I am Mexican. I am a migrant, sometimes invisible, sometimes central. But above all, I am a survivor who learned, albeit late, that it is never enough to cross the border. One must also cross the internal borders of loneliness and silence. In the months that followed, every small achievement was cause for celebration. I finished the English course, and although my accent never disappeared, I was no longer ashamed of it. I found myself giving instructions and joking with American classmates, surprised that I could laugh in another language. I enrolled Carmen in my night class. Amid laughter and competition, we accompanied each other in learning together, healing something in our marriage that we had been ignoring for years. Work became less central. I accepted a part-time position supervising crews of newly arrived Latinos. Instead of being the invisible man, I became a mentor, explaining not only the tasks, but also the codes of coexistence in this strange country. I felt useful, but this time in a new way, less painful and more human. At home, we established new habits. On Sundays, we put our cell phones aside and cooked, trying recipes from both worlds. Mole with turkey instead of chicken, pancakes with cajeta. We laughed at our experiments, invited Ana and Miguel's friends over, and for the first time, I saw my children proud to be as Mexican as they were American. The conversations changed. They were no longer just about bills and to-do lists. We talked about music, politics, dreams, memories. I finally got the courage to write my story. At first, it was an exercise in memory, but it soon became a way to ask for forgiveness and give thanks to my family and myself. Carmen read the first draft and cried softly. "That's how life was," she said. "We were afraid, but we weren't alone." Ana shared some of the text with her friends, and to my surprise, they came to meet me. Miguel, who is harder to move, hugged me tightly and said, "Thank you for not giving up, old man." I picked up my guitar again. I don't play as well as I did when I was young, but I dared to sing at community gatherings. I learned to enjoy the present. A coffee with Carmen in the New York rain, a walk by the sea in Coney Island, a soccer game with my children and grandchildren. I accepted that happiness would no longer be a triumphant return to Michoacan, but rather those stolen moments in the routine, laughter in the midst of exhaustion, the pride of seeing my loved ones grow up to be better and freer than me. One day, without saying a word, I booked tickets for Carmen and me to return to Mexico for a month. When we landed in Uruapan, the heat, the smells of the market, and the family bustle assaulted me like a long-awaited hug. We cried when we saw my parents' grave. We laughed at the village festivals. We had dinner with the few friends who were left. But I knew, with peace, that it was no longer my home, but my roots. The place you are grateful for, but which you must let go of in order to grow elsewhere. Back in the United States, the nostalgia was different. It no longer hurt. On the contrary, it was a gentle bond that kept me whole and light at the same time. For the first time in all those years, I felt that I too belonged, that I was no longer the illegal who is only good for work, but Rodrigo, father, husband, friend, migrant, and above all, worthy of love, life, and peace. I'm telling you my story, my friend, because I know there are thousands like me out there. Simple people who carried fears, who lost irreplaceable things trying to achieve the impossible. If you who are listening or reading are thinking about crossing, or have already crossed and feel invisible, don't be silent. don't shut yourself off. Speak up, seek help, demand respect, and be patient with yourself. Dreams are important, but no one should lose themselves in the attempt to leave a mark. To those who have just arrived, I say, crying is not weakness, asking questions is strength, and keeping your roots alive is possible even if everything around you changes. Hold on to your smells, your songs, your words, because no one else will bring them back for you. To those who, like me, feel that they no longer fit in either there or here, calm down. Identity is not a straight line, it is a back and forth. Sometimes it will be painful, but it is also the source of a strength that many do not understand. The strength to rebuild yourself, to transform nostalgia into empathy and fear into stories for your grandchildren. And if you have family far away, call them today. Do it before it becomes a more complicated number to dial, a voice that fades away. Tell them you love them, even if it's with clumsy words, even if it's with tears. I, Rodrigo, am no longer just what I do in my work, nor the ghost of my family's past. I am what I choose to be, every day inventing love and fighting against my own silences. If my story touched you, tell me yours. Share this message, because together, even if we are scattered, we weave that invisible and powerful community that no wall or border can uproot. God bless you, wherever you are, migrant or compatriot. And if you can, subscribe, leave a comment. Not for me. Do it so that no one is left unheard. Because in the end, all of us, here and there, just want to know that our story, with its tears and laughter, is worth telling.